Move. Somebody call the medical team now. Suga's voice cracked through the deafening noise of the crowded airport terminal, his hands trembling as he dropped to his knees beside Jimin's motionless body. Jimin, open your eyes. Please, don't do this, he whispered, his tears falling before anyone around him realized what was happening. Cameras stopped flashing. Reporters froze. Even the fans who had been cheering only seconds earlier stood in stunned silence, watching a moment they never imagined they would witness. But what shattered Suga wasn't only seeing Jimin lose consciousness in front of everyone. It was the heartbreaking secret Jimin had quietly carried for days without telling a single member. Was this simply exhaustion, or had everyone, including Suga, failed to notice the silent cry for help hidden behind Jimin's familiar smile? Before we uncover what truly happened, tell us honestly. If you were Suga in that terrifying moment, what would you have done? The automatic glass doors of Incheon International Airport slid open and closed in an endless rhythm, allowing waves of warm summer air to blend with the cool conditioned atmosphere inside the terminal. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors, flight announcements echoed overhead in calm, practiced voices, and camera shutters clicked almost without pause as hundreds of reporters and army gathered behind security barriers. It was early evening, only a few hours before sunset, and BTS had just returned from an overseas promotional schedule that had stretched across multiple countries in less than 2 weeks. Fatigue lingered beneath every smile, yet the members continued greeting fans with genuine warmth, bowing politely despite the obvious exhaustion in their eyes. Jimin walked near the center of the group, dressed simply in a black hoodie beneath a lightweight jacket, his baseball cap pulled low enough to shade his face, while still revealing the familiar smile fans had come to cherish. Beside him, Suga moved at an unhurried pace, occasionally glancing toward Jimin with the quiet attentiveness that had developed through years of working, traveling, and growing together. Neither of them spoke much during the walk. They rarely needed to. Their friendship had reached the point where silence often communicated more than words ever could. Behind them, RM answered a brief question from a journalist while Jin exchanged playful waves with fans holding handmade banners. Jungkook smiled shyly at a group of children who excitedly called his name. V paused long enough to accept a small handwritten letter from a young fan through security staff, and J-Hope instinctively encouraged everyone to keep moving before the crowd became too congested. The atmosphere appeared completely ordinary, almost comforting in its familiarity. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like another routine airport arrival after another successful schedule. Yet hidden beneath the polished routine were tiny details no camera considered important. Jimin's steps were slightly slower than usual. His fingers occasionally pressed against the side of his ribs, as though easing an ache he hoped nobody would notice. Once, while photographers shouted his name, his smile arrived a fraction of a second later than expected before settling naturally onto his face again. The delay lasted barely an instant, too brief for most people to recognize. Suga did. He looked at Jimin for a moment longer than usual, narrowing his eyes with quiet concern, but Jimin caught the glance and answered it with a reassuring nod that silently said, "I'm okay." It was the same expression he had used countless times over the years whenever he wanted to protect the people around him from worrying. Suga hesitated, then reluctantly accepted the answer, believing perhaps it was only the unavoidable exhaustion that followed weeks of rehearsals, interviews, flights, and sleepless nights. None of them realized that within minutes, the ordinary rhythm of another airport arrival would be interrupted by a single terrifying moment that would leave every witness questioning how someone who smiled so brightly could have been carrying such invisible weight. Beyond the crowd barriers, almost invisible among the sea of excited faces, stood a young airport sanitation worker named Han So-jin, 26 years old, wearing a neatly pressed maintenance uniform and disposable gloves that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Most travelers passed her without a second glance. Her job was to quietly clean the spaces everyone else hurried through, ensuring the terminal remained spotless while remaining unnoticed herself. Yet that evening, her attention wasn't on the polished floors or overflowing bins. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward the approaching BTS members, especially Jimin and Suga. Folded carefully inside the pocket of her uniform was an old concert ticket from years earlier, its edges softened from being unfolded and refolded countless times. It had become more than a souvenir. It was a reminder of a promise she had made to her younger brother, Min-jae, before illness slowly confined him to a hospital bed. They had dreamed of attending another BTS concert together one day. Instead, hospital visits replaced music festivals, and expensive treatments replaced family vacations. Seojin never spoke about that promise at work. She smiled politely, finished every shift, then traveled directly to the hospital carrying homemade meals and encouraging words she sometimes no longer believed herself. Even Min-jae didn't know she had quietly taken extra overnight shifts to keep paying medical expenses after their father's small business failed. As BTS moved closer through the terminal, Seojin instinctively stepped backward to avoid interfering with security. She had no intention of asking for photographs or autographs. Simply seeing the group from afar felt enough to carry back to her brother, who often watched old performances from his hospital room whenever the pain became difficult to bear. Meanwhile, Jimin noticed something almost no one else did. While cameras focused on celebrities and reporters shouted questions, his gaze briefly settled on the exhausted young worker, standing perfectly still with tired eyes that held far more worry than excitement. She smiled when their eyes met, but it was the kind of smile that seemed carefully practiced, one that concealed sleepless nights and quiet heartbreak rather than happiness. Jimin slowed almost imperceptibly, as if sensing a familiar loneliness hidden behind professional composure. Suga followed Jimin's line of sight, but saw only another airport employee returning to work after pausing for a moment. Before either of them could think more about it, security urged the group forward as the growing crowd became increasingly difficult to manage. Neither Jimin nor Seojin knew that their brief exchange of glances would soon become intertwined by a life-altering event. In only a matter of moments, the invisible burdens both of them had been carrying, one hidden behind a celebrity's reassuring smile, the other behind an ordinary worker's quiet resilience, would collide in a way that no camera, no schedule, and no carefully planned day could have predicted.
The distance between the terminal exit and the waiting vehicles was no more than a few dozen meters, yet that evening it seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the growing roar of cameras, flashing lights, and voices calling each member's name from every direction. Security personnel formed a protective corridor, asking everyone to remain behind the barriers as BTS continued forward with calm professionalism. J-Hope glanced over his shoulder, making sure everyone was keeping pace, while RM thanked the media for waiting patiently despite the increasingly crowded walkway. Jin continued smiling for the younger fans near the front, careful to acknowledge as many faces as possible. Jungkook instinctively moved closer to Jimin after noticing his unusually quiet demeanor, though he assumed his older teammate was simply conserving energy after another sleepless flight. V, walking only a step behind Suga, noticed the older rapper repeatedly looking toward Jimin instead of the crowd. "Hyung," V said quietly, careful not to attract attention. "Is everything okay?" Suga answered after a brief pause. "I don't know, something feels different today." V followed his gaze but saw Jimin politely waving to fans exactly as he always did. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Suga could not ignore the uneasy feeling tightening inside his chest. It wasn't something he could explain logically. Years of sharing recording studios, rehearsals, concerts, late-night conversations, and silent moments had taught him to recognize even the smallest changes in Jimin's expressions. The smile looked genuine, but the eyes behind it carried an unfamiliar heaviness. As they approached the final section of the terminal, Jimin subtly slowed again. He inhaled more deeply than usual, as though each breath required greater effort. His fingertips briefly tightened around the strap of his shoulder bag before relaxing almost immediately. He caught Suga watching and responded with another reassuring smile. "I'm fine," Jimin murmured softly enough that only Suga could hear. "Just a little tired." Suga wasn't convinced. "You've been saying that for 3 days," he replied, lowering his voice. "Have you actually been sleeping?" Jimin laughed quietly, hopping to lighten the moment. "Since when did you become my doctor?" "Since you stopped telling me the truth," Suga answered without smiling. Before Jimin could respond, a young child standing behind the barrier suddenly held up a small handmade drawing. It showed all 7 BTS members standing beneath a handwritten sentence that read, "Thank you for helping my big brother smile again." Jimin immediately noticed it. Despite his fatigue, he walked a single step closer within the security line and accepted the drawing with both hands, bowing respectfully toward the child and the parents beside him. The little boy beamed with pride while his mother struggled to hide tears. "Please tell your brother," Jimin said warmly, "that we're cheering for him too." The family nodded repeatedly, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Nearby, Seojin witnessed the exchange while standing beside her maintenance cart. Watching Jimin comfort complete strangers despite his obvious exhaustion reminded her painfully of Minyi. She instinctively reached into her pocket, touching the worn concert ticket once again. Her shift would end in less than an hour, and afterward she planned to bring dinner to the hospital, pretending everything was under control even though another treatment payment was due the following morning. She lowered her eyes, whispering almost to herself, "Just hold on a little longer." At nearly the same moment, Jimin's vision blurred. The bright airport lights suddenly seemed harsher, their reflections stretching across the polished floor like wavering ribbons. The sounds around him became strangely distant, as if the bustling terminal had drifted to the far end of a tunnel. He blinked once then twice, trying to regain focus without alarming anyone. Suga immediately noticed the hesitation in Jimin's steps. "Jimin?" he asked quietly. Jimin answered with another faint smile, but this time the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. His breathing grew uneven. His shoulders subtly tensed. A cold wave of dizziness swept through him before he could steady himself. None of the cameras understood what they were capturing. Most assumed he had merely paused to greet another fan. Only Suga saw the color draining from Jimin's face. Only Suga recognized the fear hidden behind Jimin's determined attempt to remain standing. And in the next heartbeat, the ordinary sounds of the airport were about to be replaced by a silence so profound that everyone present would remember it for the rest of their lives. Everything happened in less than 3 seconds, yet for those who witnessed it, time seemed to fracture into slow, unforgettable fragments. Jimin took one more step toward the waiting vehicles, his fingers instinctively reaching for the strap across his shoulder as though searching for balance. His breathing caught. The smile he had been holding for the cameras disappeared completely. His eyes lost focus, staring somewhere beyond the crowded terminal. Suga's expression changed instantly. "Jimin," he called, his voice low but urgent. Jimin tried to answer but no words came. His knees suddenly gave way. Before anyone else could react, his body collapsed forward. Suga lunged without hesitation, catching as much of Jimin's weight as he could before he struck the polished floor. The impact echoed through the terminal anyway, followed by a silence so complete that even the constant airport announcements seemed to disappear beneath it. Camera shutters stopped clicking. Reporters lowered their microphones. Hundreds of fans stood frozen, unable to process what they had just seen. "Jimin, look at me," Suga shouted, dropping to both knees as he carefully supported Jimin's head. His hands trembled uncontrollably. "Open your eyes, come on please." There was no response. Jimin's eyelids remained closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. For the first time in years, Suga's composure completely shattered in public. Tears filled his eyes almost instantly. He wasn't thinking about the cameras surrounding them or the headlines that would follow. All he saw was the friend who had shared countless stages, sleepless nights, victories, failures, laughter, and quiet conversations with him, now lying frighteningly still. "Don't leave me like this," Suga whispered, his voice breaking as tears rolled freely down his face. Jungkook reached them first, dropping beside Suga with panic written across his face. "Hayoung, what happened?" RM immediately signaled security to clear the area while maintaining remarkable calm despite the fear in his eyes. "Everyone, give them space. Medical team now." Jin gently guided the younger members backward to prevent the growing crowd from pressing closer. Though he could barely hide his own shock, V covered his mouth with trembling hands, unable to take his eyes off Jimin, while J-Hope repeatedly called Jimin's name, hopping desperately for any sign of movement. Nearby, Seo Jin abandoned her maintenance cart without a second thought. Years of accompanying her brother through hospitals had taught her basic emergency response. She knelt beside Suga but kept a respectful distance. "His airway is clear," she said softly but firmly, trying to steady everyone around her. "The medical team is almost here, keep talking to him." Suga looked at the unfamiliar woman through tear-filled eyes, barely registering who she was before returning his attention to Jimin. He gently held Jimin's hand between both of his own. "You promised we'd rest after this schedule," he whispered. "You said we'd finally have dinner together without rushing anywhere, so don't break your promise." For a brief moment, Jimin's fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. Suga felt it immediately. "He moved," he cried, hope flickering across his tear-stained face. But the movement faded as quickly as it had come. Seconds later, airport paramedics arrived with emergency equipment, carefully taking over while Suga reluctantly loosened his grip. As they prepared to move Jimin onto a stretcher, something slipped from the pocket of Jimin's jacket onto the floor, a small folded medical envelope. It landed beside Suga's knee. Without thinking, he picked it up. Across the front in unmistakably clear letters were the words, "Follow-up evaluation not yet attended." Suga stared at the envelope, his breathing becoming uneven once again. In that instant, a terrifying realization struck him harder than Jimin's collapse itself. This hadn't happened without warning. Somewhere sometime before today, Jimin had known something was wrong, and he had chosen to carry that burden alone. The ambulance doors closed with a heavy metallic sound that seemed to separate two different worlds. Outside, flashing blue emergency lights reflected across the airport glass, while journalists struggled to gather information and anxious fans stood together in silent prayer, many holding back tears as rumors spread faster than verified facts. Inside the ambulance, however, there was only the quiet rhythm of medical equipment, the soft hum of the engine, and the fragile sound of hope refusing to disappear. Suga sat beside the stretcher with permission from the paramedics, his eyes never leaving Jimin's pale face. He held Jimin's hand gently, careful not to interfere with the intravenous line that had just been inserted. Every few seconds he unconsciously tightened his grip, as if afraid that letting go even for a moment might somehow allow the distance between them to grow. The medical envelope remained folded inside his jacket pocket. He had not opened it. Somehow he already feared what it might reveal. The silence became almost unbearable. Suga lowered his head and spoke so quietly that only Jimin could possibly hear. "You always tell everyone they're not alone." His voice cracked. "So why did you decide to be alone yourself?" His words were not filled with anger. They carried only sadness, disappointment, and the helplessness of someone realizing he had overlooked the pain of a person standing closest to him. The ambulance continued through the evening traffic under police escort. Outside, the city lights stretched into long reflections across the windows like blurred memories passing too quickly to hold on to. At the hospital entrance, doctors and nurses were already waiting. Jimin was transferred immediately toward the emergency department, disappearing behind swinging doors that closed before Suga could take another step. For the first time since the collapse, he had nothing to do except wait. Hospitals had their own language. The quiet footsteps in long corridors, the distant sound of monitors, the smell of antiseptic lingering in every room, the uncomfortable chairs where families silently negotiated between hope and fear. Suga sat alone beneath harsh white lighting, staring at the closed emergency room doors without moving. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. The rest of the members arrived one after another. RM placed a bottle of water beside Suga without saying anything. Jin quietly sat to his left. Jungkook remained standing near the window, unable to stop packing. V leaned against the wall with his hands clasped together, eyes lowered. J-Hope looked toward the emergency room every time a doctor appeared, only to realize they were walking toward another patient's family. No one knew the right words. Finally, RM broke the silence. "Have you eaten today?" Suga slowly shook his head. Neither did he. The sentence hung in the air. "He skipped breakfast," Suga continued quietly. "Said he wasn't hungry. Yesterday he barely touched dinner. I noticed." His voice faded before returning even softer. "I noticed." And I still believed him when he smiled. Nobody answered because each member began replaying recent days inside their own minds. Small moments, quiet pauses, half-finished meals, forced laughter, tiny signs that had seemed insignificant until now. Regret settled over the room, not because anyone had neglected Jimin intentionally, but because love sometimes becomes so accustomed to seeing someone appear strong that it mistakes endurance for well-being. At that moment, a nurse approached Suga carrying a small transparent belongings bag. Inside were Jimin's watch, wallet, phone, and the folded medical envelope that had fallen at the airport. "These were in his jacket," she said gently. "You may keep them until he's awake." Suga thanked her with a slight bow. After she walked away, he stared at the envelope for several long moments before carefully opening it with trembling hands. The room remained completely silent. Inside was a recommendation for additional medical examinations following repeated episodes of dizziness. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, and abnormal blood pressure recorded several days earlier during a routine health assessment. At the bottom, a handwritten note from the physician read, "Please avoid excessive schedules until further evaluation is completed." Suga closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his face before he folded the paper exactly as he had found it. "He knew," he whispered. He knew, and he kept working because he didn't want anyone to worry. No one spoke. There was nothing left to argue against. Just then another familiar figure quietly entered the waiting area. It was Han Seojin, still wearing her airport maintenance uniform. She held a small paper bag containing bottled water and warm bread she had purchased from the hospital convenience store. She hesitated before approaching. "I'm sorry for interrupting," she said softly. "I only wanted to return this." She extended the old concert ticket that had accidentally fallen from her pocket during the chaos at the airport. Suga looked at the worn ticket, then at the exhausted young woman standing before him. He remembered seeing her beside Jimin before everything happened. There was something familiar in her eyes, the same determination to hide pain behind quiet composure that Jimin had carried all week. And without realizing it, another story, one that had been unfolding silently alongside theirs all along, was about to change every one of their lives forever. Suga accepted the faded concert ticket with both hands, studying the worn edges that had clearly been protected for years rather than days. Before he could return it, his attention was drawn to the handwritten message on the back, its ink beginning to fade but still legible beneath the hospital lights. "We'll come back together next time. I promise, Minyi." Suga slowly looked up. Seojin immediately realized he had seen the writing and instinctively lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean for anyone to read that." Suga gently shook his head. "Who's Minyi?" For several seconds, Seojin said nothing. The waiting room remained silent except for the distant beeping of cardiac monitors echoing through the corridor. Finally, she took a slow breath. "My younger brother." Her voice remained calm, but the exhaustion behind it could no longer hide. He was diagnosed with a rare heart condition 4 years ago. BTS became the reason he smiled on the hardest days. "We promised we'd attend another concert together after his treatment." She glanced toward the floor. "We never got the chance. Jungkook looked up immediately. Is he? Seojin nodded gently. He's still fighting, he's upstairs. She pointed toward the upper floors of the hospital. I came here after work because he was admitted again this morning. The room fell into another heavy silence. Suddenly every detail connected. The tired eyes at the airport, the carefully folded concert ticket, the quiet composure that had reminded Jimin so much of himself. RM slowly exhaled, realizing why Jimin had paused to look toward the airport worker despite everything happening around him. He noticed her, RM whispered, even while he wasn't feeling well himself. Suga closed his hand around the ticket. At that moment the emergency room doors finally opened. Every member stood simultaneously. A physician removed his surgical mask before speaking. He's awake. No one moved for half a heartbeat, almost afraid they had misheard. Relief swept through the hallway so suddenly that Jungkook covered his face with both hands while Jin quietly wiped away tears he had tried unsuccessfully to hide. V leaned against the wall, letting out the breath he felt he had been holding since the airport. J-Hope smiled through watery eyes, repeatedly whispering, "Thank goodness, thank goodness." Suga reached Jimin's room first. The lights had been dimmed to allow him to rest. Soft rain had begun outside, tapping gently against the hospital window. Jimin looked pale, his movements slow, but when he saw Suga standing in the doorway, he managed a faint, apologetic smile. Before Jimin could speak, Suga crossed the room and embraced him carefully, mindful of the medical equipment attached to his body. Neither of them said a word for several long seconds. The silence carried everything words could not. Finally, Suga pulled back just enough to look directly into Jimin's eyes. "Don't ever do that to me again." His voice trembled. "I thought," he stopped, unable to finish. Jimin's own eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I kept thinking I could get through one more schedule, then another. I didn't want everyone to cancel plans because of me." Suga gently shook his head. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Jimin lowered his eyes. "You trusted your strength more than you trusted us." The words landed softly without accusation, but they pierced deeper than anger ever could. Jimin's tears finally escaped. "I was afraid I'd disappoint everyone." Suga reached forward and rested his forehead lightly against Jimin's. "You disappoint us only when you believe you have to suffer alone." Neither noticed the other members quietly stepping back toward the hallway, giving them privacy. Standing outside the room, Seojin watched through the partially open door before quietly turning to leave. She believed this moment belonged only to them. Just as she reached the elevator, a weak voice called from behind. "Excuse me," she turned. Jimin was standing in the doorway despite the protests of a nurse, supported on one side by Suga. His steps were unsteady, but his expression remained warm. "Are you Seojin?" She nodded in surprise. Jimin smiled gently. "I remember your face from the airport." He glanced toward the old concert ticket still in Suga's hand. "Your brother, Minyi, is he here?" Tears instantly filled Seojin's eyes. She could only nod. "Would it be all right?" Jimin continued softly, "if we visited him together?" Less than 10 minutes later, 7 familiar figures quietly entered a pediatric cardiac ward without cameras, without announcements, and without anyone outside the hospital knowing. Minyi, weakened by months of treatment, looked up from his bed in disbelief. His oxygen tube shifted slightly as his eyes widened. "No," he whispered, "I'm dreaming." Jimin smiled gently despite his own exhaustion. "If this is a dream," he replied, pulling a chair beside the bed, "then let's stay in it for a little while." In that small hospital room where illness had long overshadowed hope, laughter slowly returned. Suga watched as Minyi smiled more brightly than anyone had seen in months. Only then did he truly understand what had happened that day. Jimin's collapse had reminded everyone that even the strongest hearts need care, but his first thought after waking was still to comfort someone else. And in that quiet room, surrounded by his members, a devoted sister, and a young fan who refused to stop believing, every thread of the day came together not through spectacle, but through compassion that quietly transformed every life it touched. Rain continued through the night, soft and steady against the hospital windows, as if the city itself had slowed its pace after the events of that extraordinary day. By morning, the headlines had already spread across television screens, online articles, and social media timelines around the world. Most reports focused on the airport incident, the sudden collapse, the emergency response, and the concern shared by millions of fans. Yet the details that mattered most never appeared in any article. No camera had captured the quiet conversation in the hospital room. No journalist knew about the worn concert ticket resting in Suga's pocket. No one outside a small circle of people understood that behind the public fear and speculation, something deeply human had unfolded in silence. Doctors confirmed that Jimin would make a full recovery, but only if he allowed himself what he had denied for far too long: rest, proper treatment, and time away from relentless schedules. The diagnosis was not dramatic. There was no hidden illness, no shocking revelation. It was something far more ordinary and perhaps more dangerous because of it: accumulated exhaustion, dehydration, stress, and the habit of ignoring warning signs in order to keep moving forward. It was a reminder that even people admired for their resilience remained vulnerable in ways that often escape public attention. For the first time in years, several planned activities were postponed without debate. Managers reorganized schedules, producers adjusted deadlines, staff members who had spent years ensuring perfect performances quietly began discussing something they had rarely considered before: not how much more artists could endure, but how much care they needed in order to continue. The atmosphere inside company practice rooms changed in subtle ways. Breaks became longer, meals were shared more often, questions such as "Have you eaten?" and "Did you sleep?" stopped sounding like casual remarks and became genuine acts of concern. Among the members, the experience left marks that could not easily be described. RM became more attentive to the emotional state of everyone around him, often pausing rehearsals simply to ask how people were doing, not as a leader managing responsibilities, but as a friend wanting honest answers. Jin, who had always used humor to lighten difficult moments, found himself staying longer after meals, making sure no one quietly disappeared before finishing their food. J-Hope, whose energy often filled every room, learned that encouragement was not always about inspiring others to push harder. Sometimes it meant reminding them that stopping was not weakness. V began carrying a small camera again, taking photographs of ordinary moments, shared dinners, empty practice rooms at sunset, members laughing without knowing they were being photographed. He said little about it, but privately he feared how easily simple moments could be taken for granted. Jungkook changed in ways that were harder to notice. He began knocking on studio doors before leaving at night, asking older members whether they needed anything before going home. It was a quiet habit, but one born from the memory of seeing someone he loved lying unconscious while feeling completely powerless. And Suga, for weeks after the incident, he kept the folded medical note inside a notebook he carried to the studio, not because he wanted to remember the fear, but because he never wanted to forget the lesson. Late one evening, nearly 3 weeks after Jimin returned home to recover, Suga sat alone in a recording studio beneath dim lights, listening to an unfinished piano melody repeating through the speakers. The room smelled faintly of coffee and wood, familiar and comforting. The city outside had long fallen asleep. The studio door opened quietly. Jimin entered wearing a simple hoodie, his hair slightly longer than before, his face noticeably healthier. "You're working late again," Jimin said softly. Suga looked up. "And you're supposed to be resting," he answered. Jimin smiled. This time it was a real smile, no hidden exhaustion, no effort behind it, just warmth. Suga gestured toward the empty chair beside him. Jimin sat down. For a while neither of them spoke. The unfinished melody continued playing, then Jimin broke the silence. "I visited Minnie yesterday." Suga turned toward him. "How is he?" "Better," Jimin replied quietly. "The doctors said treatment is going well." Jin said he laughs more now. Suga nodded slowly. Outside the studio window, the first light of dawn had begun to color the sky. "Funny," Suga said after a long pause. "What? I thought the hardest part of that day was seeing you collapse." Jimin looked at him silently. "But it wasn't." Suga's voice became softer. "Hardest part was realizing that people can stand right beside someone they love, and still not know how much pain they're carrying." Jimin lowered his eyes, then, after a moment, he answered, "Maybe that's why we need each other." No dramatic music accompanied the conversation. No cameras recorded it, yet those simple words remained with Suga long afterward, because they were true. Meanwhile, in a hospital room several floors above another quiet corridor in the same city, Minnie carefully placed a framed photograph beside his bed. It showed 7 familiar faces, one smiling airport worker, and a young patient surrounded not by illness, but by hope. Visitors often asked him why he smiled whenever he looked at it. Minnie always gave the same answer: because that day reminded all of us that kindness is stronger when it travels from one person to another. And perhaps that was the real consequence of what happened at the airport: not fear, not headlines, not public attention, but the invisible chain of care that continued long after the crowds disappeared. Months passed, and the frightening scene at the airport gradually disappeared from headlines. New concerts, new albums, and new stories captured public attention, just as they always did. Yet for the people whose lives had quietly intersected that evening, time did not erase the experience. Instead, it transformed it into something deeper, an invisible thread connecting them through choices they would continue making long after the cameras had turned away. Jimin returned to performing only after completing his recovery, following every recommendation from his medical team without exception. The first rehearsal back felt unfamiliar. The mirrors in the practice room reflected the same determined artist, yet something had undeniably changed. Between songs, he no longer brushed aside fatigue with a smile. If he needed water, he stopped. If he needed rest, he rested. At first, the habit felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural. Years of pushing through discomfort had become second nature, but every time he hesitated. He remembered the terrified expression on Suga's face at the airport and quietly reminded himself that protecting others also meant protecting the people who loved him enough to worry. Suga changed in quieter ways. He became more attentive than ever, not only toward Jimin but toward every member. During recording sessions, he noticed who had skipped lunch. During rehearsals, he recognized when someone's concentration began fading. During long flights, he gently reminded everyone to sleep instead of continuing to work. The members occasionally teased him for becoming the strict Hayoung, but beneath the laughter was gratitude. They understood why. One evening, while the group rested after rehearsal, Jungkook smiled and joked, "Hayoung checks our meals more often than our manager now." Room filled with laughter. Suga simply shrugged. "I'd rather be annoying than scared again." Laughter softened. Nobody argued. Because every one of them remembered, RM quietly introduced regular wellness check-ins before demanding schedules. Jin began preparing late-night meals whenever rehearsals stretched longer than expected. J-Hope made it a habit to ask each staff member, not just the members themselves, whether they had eaten. V often lingered after practice to talk with younger dancers who looked overwhelmed. Small acts, simple conversations. Tiny decisions that never appeared on stage but slowly shaped the atmosphere around everyone. The change reached beyond BTS. Inspired by conversations with hospital staff, Seojin established a volunteer network connecting airport employees with children's hospitals across Seoul. Workers who once believed they had little to offer began donating books, drawing supplies, blankets, and time. Every month, volunteers visited children receiving long-term treatment, not because they were asked, but because they remembered how one unexpected evening had shown them the extraordinary power hidden inside ordinary kindness. Minnie's recovery remained gradual. There were difficult days, there were setbacks, there were nights when fear returned, but there were also victories that once seemed impossible. First time he walked the entire hospital corridor without assistance, nurses applauded softly from nearby stations. The first time he returned home for an overnight visit, Seojin cried quietly in the kitchen so her brother wouldn't see. Months later, when doctors finally approved limited outdoor activities, the siblings visited a nearby park together. Sitting beneath autumn trees, Minnie unfolded the framed concert ticket from its protective case. "It doesn't belong in a drawer anymore," he said. Seojin smiled. "Where should it go?" Minnie looked toward children laughing nearby. "Somewhere people can remember that hope sometimes arrives when nobody expects it." Nearly a year after the airport incident, BTS quietly arranged a private visit to a small charity concert supporting young patients with chronic illnesses. There were no televised broadcasts, no promotional campaigns, and no official press releases. The audience was made up of children, families, nurses, and volunteers. Before performing, Jimin noticed a familiar face in the front row, Minyi. This time he wasn't wearing a hospital gown. He stood on his own, a little thinner than most teenagers his age but smiling with unmistakable confidence. Beside him stood Seojin holding the same framed ticket. Jimin looked toward Suga. Neither spoke, neither needed to. During the final song of the evening, Jimin quietly stepped to the edge of the stage and looked directly at Minyi. Without saying a word, he placed his hand gently over his heart. Minyi returned the gesture. Across the stage, Suga smiled, not with relief alone but with quiet gratitude. The memory of the airport would never completely disappear, nor should it, because it had become more than a frightening day. It had become a reminder shared by everyone whose lives had been touched by it, that the strongest friendships are not measured by how often people stand together in moments of success, but by how gently they hold one another when strength unexpectedly gives way to vulnerability. Years later, people still remembered that evening at the airport, but not because it had become another headline. Headlines fade. Videos disappear beneath newer ones. Trending topics are eventually replaced. What endured was something cameras could never fully capture: the quiet decisions made after the chaos ended, the hand that refused to let go, the apology spoken without pride, the forgiveness offered without conditions, the stranger who became family through a single act of compassion. Looking back, it would have been easy to describe the day as the moment Jimin collapsed, but that would have overlooked the deeper truth. The real story began long before anyone noticed him fall. It began with a young man convincing himself that enduring pain alone was an act of love. It continued with a friend who blamed himself for missing the signs hidden behind familiar smiles. It unfolded through an airport worker carrying her own invisible heartbreak while believing no one would ever notice it. And it reached its quiet conclusion in a hospital room, where people from completely different lives discovered that empathy has an extraordinary way of dissolving the distance between strangers. None of them set out to change one another's lives. There was no grand plan, no dramatic speech, no perfect hero. There were only ordinary human choices made in extraordinary circumstances: to stop walking, to listen instead of assuming, to ask one more question, to stay a little longer, to tell someone they mattered before it became too late. Perhaps that is why the memory remained so powerful. It reminded everyone that strength is often misunderstood. Strength is not pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Strength is allowing someone to witness your weakness without believing it makes you less worthy of love. It is trusting that the people beside you would rather share your burden than watch you carry it alone. For Jimin, recovery became more than healing his body. It became permission to accept care as naturally as he had always offered it to others. For Suga, that frightening day transformed quiet concern into intentional presence, teaching him that sometimes the greatest expression of friendship is simply noticing the moments everyone else overlooks. For the other members, it reaffirmed that success means very little if achieved at the expense of one another's well-being. For Seojin and Minyi, a chance encounter became proof that kindness does not require perfect timing, wealth, or influence. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than recognizing another person's silent struggle. And for everyone who witnessed the story, whether inside the airport, within the hospital walls, or from far away, it left behind a gentle invitation rather than a lesson. Look a little closer. Ask one more time if someone is truly okay. Believe actions as much as smiles. Offer your presence even when you cannot solve the problem. because the people who appear strongest are often carrying the heaviest burdens without saying a word. If this fictional story leaves anything behind, let it be this: every life is quietly connected to countless others in ways we rarely notice. A single moment of patience may become someone's reason to keep going. A single conversation may interrupt loneliness before it grows into despair. A single act of compassion may ripple outward for years, touching people we will never meet. Long after stages grow dark, airports empty, and applause fades into silence, those moments remain. They become the invisible legacy of people who chose kindness when no one expected it. And perhaps that is the most meaningful performance any human being could ever give, not under bright lights before thousands of voices, but in the quiet places where empathy asks for nothing in return yet changes everything. This story is a work of fiction inspired by public figures. The events portrayed are entirely imagined and are not presented as real occurrences.